Suicide prevention in the Black community. September is Suicide Prevention Month, so we are talking about suicide prevention. This is a different topic than what I normally talk about on my YouTube channel or on LinkedIn. However, because this is September, Suicide Prevention Month, it is important for us to have this conversation to raise awareness about suicide prevention. So I wanted to share some information in terms of suicide rates. And I would say that within the Black community, we've talked a little bit more about suicide, particularly after the loss of Dr. Antoinette Bonnie Candia Bailey, that we talked about a lot before in terms of we heard about what she experienced in the workplace and workplace bullying and what happened to her. And that brought up a lot of concern and worry about what her experiences were and what happened and her eventually taking her life. So there are increased conversations about suicide within the Black community. And we also know that the suicide rates for Black youth have really been increasing. And I've been talking about the rates of Black youth suicide for a number of years now. And I just want to just give some stats on that. So the rates of Black youth suicide actually have been increasing for a number of years. And what we're seeing is that over the past 2 decades, actually, the rates for Black youth suicide have been increasing at a rate that we have not seen. So the rate for Black youth suicide has been increasing at a rate that's faster than any other group. Okay, so we need to recognize that this is very serious. And actually, the rate is from 2007 to 2020, the suicide rate for Black youth has increased by 144% among Black youth ages 10 to 17 years old. Okay. So we need to be very aware of the rates. And it's very important for us not to just stick our head in the sand and say, that's not something that we do in our community, because it is. And so when we think about these topics, it's difficult for us to hear about, it's difficult for us to think about, but we have to be aware of this information so that we can recognize what are the risk factors, the warning signs, and what are the things that we can do to prevent these issues. So I also wanted to say that I do understand this is a sensitive topic and that this might bring up a range of issues for you if you have maybe had suicidal thoughts, or maybe you know of someone that maybe you've lost someone to suicide, or maybe you have someone you cared about and maybe they've struggled with suicidal thoughts. So this may be a difficult conversation. Okay, so I really want to encourage you to really pay attention to yourself. Be mindful of this information. If it's difficult for you to hear, just really monitor yourself. If you need to just take a pause and step away and maybe listen to this later, really pay attention to yourself. I also want to mention that the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number is going across the screen. I will leave that information up. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you can dial it, you can call that number or text it 24 hours a day by calling or texting 988. Okay. So again, this is a very important and necessary conversation. Again, September is Suicide Prevention Month. So I am very honored to have Dr. Janelle Goodwill here with us today. So Dr. Goodwill, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. So, my name is Janelle Goodwill. I'm an assistant professor in the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice at the University of Chicago. My research really focuses on preventing suicide and promoting positive mental health outcomes for Black communities, whether that's young people all the way into adulthood. And so I'm based in Chicago and do a lot of community engaged, community-based research that really is designed to help see the flourishing and the well-being of Black communities, both locally and across the country.
hmm So, can we talk a little bit about the stigma of even talking about suicide within the Black community? I would say, since maybe like 5 years ago, there's been less stigma of talking about mental health within the Black community.
Yeah.
But suicide still has a lot of stigma within our community. So, can we talk a little bit about what do you think is contributing to the stigma about suicide? And why is it important for us in our community to talk about this issue?
Certainly. So, stigma is complex and it's multifaceted. So, in the research, we see that there's stigma related to mental health help seeking. So, just someone being willing at the onset to even go and seek help from a professional like yourself. And then there's
Mhm,
also stigma related to being formally diagnosed with a mental illness. And so,
mhm,
I think it's important that the audience recognizes that we're dealing with stigma on multiple fronts. There's
mhm,
stigma as it relates to just being willing to seek help in the first place. And then
mhm,
there's also this other form of stigma that's related to a formal diagnosis for a mental illness. And so
mhm,
I think that these forms of stigma really do emerge out of societal expectations for what a Black person can and should do. And
mhm,
whenever someone deviates from that, or maybe doesn't align with what society has told us, it can be threatening or scary or very challenging for some people. And so I
mhm,
think that generationally, we do see some differences as it relates to acceptance, openness, willingness to discuss these topics. But
mhm,
there's still so much more work that we need to do in
mhm,
order to ensure that we're having these conversations much earlier, because the cost of not discussing
mhm.
suicide risk and mental health concerns can ultimately be really dire.
Mm. And I've heard many times where people have said things like, you need to pray it away,
Mm,
or you're not a good Christian because you're struggling with these issues or you're having these thoughts.
hmm,
So there's something wrong with you as a Christian. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because we know in some way spirituality and religion can be protective factors, but
certainly.
when is it an issue in which it may prevent someone from seeking mental health treatment, or it may cause a sense of shame if someone is struggling with mental health
Yeah.
issues or suicidal thoughts in terms of accessing treatment?
Oh, I love that question. That's such an important question. And I'm so glad we'll get to talk about it. So, yes, you're definitely right. There are some aspects of religious participation and spirituality that can be protective.
Mhm,
So, things like communal relationships that are fostered within
mhm,
religious settings, or
mhm,
even being able to cope with the stressors of
mhm,
this life by turning
mhm,
to someone's religion and their faith, that
mhm,
can really help fortify people in the midst of hardship.
mhm,
But there are other aspects of religiosity and faith that can be harmful. So sometimes the shame, sometimes really the, I think, closed mindedness and narrow mindedness around an unwillingness to seek help. I think that unfortunately sometimes there are instances of spiritual abuse and clergy abuse that can happen in houses of worship that can ultimately really impact someone's well-being.
mhm,
Now, we know that religion looks different amongst Black folks today. So the
mhm,
research indicates that there's Pew data that we can link in the show notes or share afterwards. But the Pew research shows that a majority of Black Americans still identify as Christian,
mhm,
though there are different forms of spirituality that are really emerging, and I think drawing great interest amongst younger people. So I think that's something to attend to as well. We're also seeing more young Black folks who are not religiously affiliated, who might identify as nuns,
mhm,
NONES. That's the language that the Pew Research study uses. And so attending to those concerns is important. Now, you began the question by asking specifically about Christianity, which I think is an important facet to consider. A lot of the research around religious involvement amongst Black folks has included or focused primarily on Christians. And I think that anyone who is in a space where they're being told that you're a bad Christian if you seek help, or that you should only pray, I
mhm,
would encourage them to refute those claims by encouraging whoever is telling them to actually go and read the text. All throughout the biblical text, we see examples of people who experience psychological distress and hardship, and they seek help from other people. They're not handling it alone, and they're not only praying. Praying is a great place to start, but
mhm,
typically that prayer should hopefully lead us to action with us community with other people, or
mhm,
seeking professional help. I'm also happy to provide additional resources. I've even got some Bible commentaries that I have up here on my shelf. I didn't even going to ask this question, but I just want to offer that perhaps the people who are saying that people are bad Christians if they seek help have not carefully read the text themselves. So I want to
mhm.
offer that.
Okay, good resources. Okay. So when we think about like the rates for mental health issues for Black people, we think
Mm,
about the stigma. for us as Black people, we know that people often see us in a certain way. And
Yeah.
we often know that when we go into workplaces, we go into schools, we know all these things that we have to present a certain image.
Certainly.
So often for us, we know that people are perceiving us in a certain way. And so we don't want to um, have something else for people to see us in a negative light, right? So
Mhm.
then that might contribute to us saying, no, I'm good. I'm good. Like, I don't
Mhm.
want people to kind of say something negative about me. However, when we look at the systemic issues of racism, sexism,
Mhm.
classism, all the other isms, all these things have a cumulative toll on us as Black people.
Yeah.
So when we think about like the rates of stress and cumulative stress, how do these systemic issues impact us in terms of our mental health?
Mhm.
And how might that translate in terms of suicidal thoughts?
Certainly. So there's been a lot of research that measures how various environmental factors can lead to higher scores and rates of depression. It's within the past decade or two that there's been a greater focus on considering how some of these stressors can actually lead to increased risk for suicide as well. So
Mm,
there have been research studies that are looking at these everyday or interpersonal forms of racism and how that's linked to more suicidal thoughts. Similarly, there's also been studies that have begun to measure how structural or systemic forms of racism can lead to experiences of suicide risk as well. So, for instance, when we're thinking about issues around health insurance and access, for me,
mm,
this is really important to highlight because stigma is important, but that's not
mhm,
the only thing, right? Like there are a number of practical barriers that are in place that would make it difficult for somebody to actually be able to connect with a clinician like yourself. And so, whether we're thinking about things like health insurance, whether we're
mm,
thinking about things like costs, like money, like someone's salary maybe not being high enough to actually be able to afford mental health treatment, even in
mhm,
thinking about who has internet access and challenges there.
mhm,
There's been, I think, a lot of research that is pointing to all of these environmental factors that are experienced at both interpersonal and systemic levels that are ultimately creating greater risk. I
mm,
think in the context of my work, I've even seen how, when looking at a sample, a national sample of over
mhm,
7,000 young people ages 10 to 17, we
mhm,
found that Black and Native youth were the most likely to be insured with Medicaid, whereas Asian and white youth are more likely to have private insurance. And this sample included 7,000 youth who all reported that they had at least attempted suicide once in their life. So even something like insurance, people typically tie to just health, physical health, but it has serious implications for mental health as well. And so I think that there are just really so many factors that are experienced about the individual and these larger structural levels
mhm.
that we really all need each other to work together in order to try to really address these concerns.
So let's drill down a little bit more with that. So you mentioned that Black and Native youth were more likely to have Medicaid,
Mhm,
and then the Asian and white youth more likely to have private insurance. So
mhm.
with private insurance, did that mean more access to mental health resources
Yes.
too?
That's what
Hmm.
it meant. Yes. So in another question, we analyzed from this national data set, and we found that yes, that the young people who had private insurance are more likely to say that they had actually seen a mental health provider in the past 12 months relative to those who did have Medicaid or CHIP. And so again, when we're thinking about the times that we're living in right now and the stressors that
Mm,
we're being bombarded with in this
yeah.
moment, it really points to the need for us to consider how in the world can we ensure that we are providing as much information, as much resources to families, to
Hmm.
individuals, to communities,
Hmm.
to organizations as
Hmm.
possible, because we've
Hmm.
got to ensure that we're trying to reach people before it's too late.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And when we think about like the language that we use about mental
Mhm.
health or suicide, like we might say, "Oh, that person's cray cray," or "That
Mhm.
person's bipolar," or they went to the crazy house, right?
Yeah.
So that's like kind of the language we use. Or we'll say that person committed suicide. Can we
Mhm.
talk about the language and why it's so important for us to be mindful of the language that we use? And even the terminology commit suicide.
Certainly.
Why is it so important for us to be mindful of that language and what is more appropriate terminology to use and not commit suicide?
Certainly. So I think it's important for us to be mindful of language because we want to be sensitive and thoughtful for how we show up and care for one another. We
Mhm,
don't know what someone else has gone through. We
mhm,
don't know who might be battling
mhm,
suicidal thoughts in their own mind or who might have recently received a mental illness diagnosis. And we
mhm,
don't want to contribute to more negative ideas about what it might mean to live with a mental illness than necessary. And so I think that the language around somebody being crazy or insane can be just very insensitive and it's not necessary. I think that
mhm,
instead we can really offer more humanizing ways of connecting with one another. So instead of saying that someone is bipolar or someone is manic, we can say that they are living with or they have been diagnosed with. I think
mhm,
that's a much more humanizing approach.
mhm,
Also, in terms of the matter of suicide, again, I'm so glad you asked this because it comes up a lot, and I think that there are very well-meaning people
mhm,
who might be making this mistake and just aren't aware of it. But when you think about what comes to our mind, the associations we have with the word commit, it's
mhm,
typically around negative things like committing a sin or committing a crime. A much more, I think, respectful and honoring phrase that we can use is died by suicide or
mhm,
died from suicide.
mhm,
Simply because there's so much and so much backstory and history around language like commit. And so researchers and clinicians really do want to encourage public audiences to be mindful of this language. And this especially comes out when there's been maybe a major suicide that happened from
mhm,
someone who had a large platform or who was famous. And you'll
mhm.
hear journalists or news stories using the language of commit.
Yeah.
And it's important that as mental health professionals that we are uh, respectfully correcting the
Mhm.
media when they do use that language because it can be ultimately really harmful and really shaming for people.
True, 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 true. So, what are some of the unique risk factors you would say for Black people in relation to having suicidal thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the research has pointed to, even amongst youth, being able to see over time a greater risk of suicide after experiencing race based discrimination and race based forms of mistreatment. So
Mm,
that's been a really concerning trend that we've noticed. There's a 2017 study published by Dr. Rita Walker, who's a clinical psychologist, and they examine young people's ideation of death in relation to also experiences of racism and discrimination. And they found that there was a positive link there that still held over time. Other unique risk factors might be experiences of racialized and gendered bullying. This is something that a lot of existing research hasn't really accounted for. So, somebody would not have to be an expert on suicide prevention to recognize that bullying is a risk factor for suicide.
mhm,
However, when you think about the ways that, let's think about Black girls in particular, who have
mhm,
experienced one of the most, or the most dramatic increase, the sharpest rise in suicides has been seen amongst Black teen girls. When you
mm,
think about the way that a young Black girl could be bullied, not just because of her race, but also because of her gender, whether
mhm,
it's because of the way her body is shaped, or the tone of her
mhm,
skin, or the texture of
mhm,
her hair. There's so
mhm.
many things that our young girls are battling
Yeah.
in these adolescent years
Mhm,
that a lot of the existing research is not accounting for the fact that our girls are told that they need to have straight hair, that they can't be too big, they can't be too skinny, they need to have the right curves, can't be too dark, but can't be too light. I mean, the
mhm,
research, I think, is really behind and failing to account for the ways that racialized and gendered forms of mistreatment could be
mhm,
uniquely impacting the experiences for Black girls. And then
mhm,
we can also think about things like interaction with systems. The systems of this world can be extremely difficult for Black families to navigate. So, whether you're thinking about child protective services, whether you're
mhm,
thinking about criminal legal system involvement, or if you're thinking about even a stop and frisk, being pulled over by the police. I mean, there
mhm,
are just so many experiences, even the school and academic system, with higher
mhm,
rates of suspension and expulsion.
mhm,
Really, the systems of this world that are in many ways working against Black families, I think provide unique risk factors
mhm.
that we must attend to.
Yeah. And you know what? As you were talking, I was thinking about, particularly for Black girls, not that Black boys are not impacted, but we think about for women, we're so held to a standard about
Mhm.
being judged about our physical appearance.
Yeah,
Okay. And I
yeah,
just think about for Black girls with social media. And I'm
yeah.
just wondering, has there been any research in relation to Black girls and the impact of social media and this expectation and the pressure to fit into this certain box,
Mm,
right? And how that impacts their self-image and what happens when you don't fit into that box.
yeah.
Has there been any research on that in relation to mental health and suicidal thoughts? Has there been any research that you're aware of with that?
Yes, yes, and I'm happy to send links so that people can check out these research studies and articles afterwards. But I'm definitely aware of some research that has examined self-image and body image and self-esteem and that association and that relationship to greater depressive symptoms among young Black girls. There's
Mhm,
also a 2024 study that was published in JAMA Psychiatry Journal that was led by Dr. Brandisha Tynes and colleagues where they examine the relationship between experiencing racism online and that relationship being positively linked to more suicide risk among Black youth generally. They didn't look at gender differences, but it certainly could be an important avenue for future research. I'll say in my work, I did find amongst a sample of young adults, so 18 to 29-year-olds. When I asked Black young adults why they considered suicide, one
mhm,
of the main reasons that Black young adult women said that they considered suicide is because they could not live up to the expectations of other people. And so when
wow,
you think about beliefs and messages that we receive, particularly around strong Black woman schema and ideal,
mhm,
I think it definitely points to a different experience, the need to think about differences that might be present within group, right? Like we know all Black folks are not the same. We vary by shape, color,
mhm,
size. We think about nationality, ethnic
mhm,
differences, class differences, sexuality, religion. There's a lot of things that we want to account for and consider when
mhm.
thinking about who might be experiencing some of the greatest risk in this time.
Mhm, mhm. And I think that because I want to talk about the Black woman schema too, and the stereotype about the strong Black woman. Um, but I was thinking too that when we think about suicide, because generally as a Black community, we don't generally talk about it, but when we have talked about it, it's often been like, "Oh, that's because, they lost their job," or
Mm,
that's because like, we try to find meaning of it, right? "Oh, that's because, they had a relationship breakup." So we try to pinpoint it to a specific issue, but
mm,
not recognizing that suicide is a very complex issue. There's
yeah,
an intersection of all these very complex things coming together. Can we talk about how important it is for us not to jump to trying to
yeah,
pinpoint one specific issue contributing to why somebody may have died by suicide, that it is a very complex issue to consider.
certainly, certainly. So I can say, based off of my research and the research of others, that most of the time there's not just one thing that's happened in
Mhm,
someone's life.
mhm,
And
mhm,
again, I don't want to minimize this because
mhm,
even globally, we do see that amongst men, losing their job and having financial instability can be a serious risk factor for suicide amongst Black men and men generally across the globe. So I don't want to minimize that.
mhm,
However, it's typically not just one thing that someone
mhm,
is wrestling with that would lead them to suicide. I
mhm,
do want to think about and encourage the audience to really consider some of the age differences we see here. So, with an adult, we're able to rationalize and recognize that, okay, I'm experiencing hardship right now, but it won't end forever. I think
mhm.
with kids and young people, there's this role of impulsiveness that
Right.
we really want to try to get a handle on and speak to
Mhm,
really early. This is why intervention in schools is important. But
mhm,
for a child, it might be very difficult for them to recognize that when they experience something traumatic, that it doesn't mean that it's the end for them. And
right.
also, kids may not recognize the finality of what it
Mhm.
means to
Yeah,
actually attempt suicide. And so
yeah.
um, I just want to highlight this consideration because we do see some differences across age groups. But again, Typically, there's not just one reason, and particularly with adults, people oftentimes think about suicide more than once, right? Like many times when people die by suicide as an adult, it's not that it just happened that day. It's really
Mhm,
that people have maybe been mulling over, wrestling with, and
mhm,
experiencing a lot of emotional pain for a long time, and have
mhm,
not been able to find that lasting sort of peace and rest in the midst of the deep sorrow and emotional pain they're experiencing.
mhm, mhm. And can we distinguish briefly the difference between self-harm and suicide?
Certainly. So self-harm, we can think about mutilating behaviors that might include things like cutting,
Mhm,
and other approaches that would actually inflict some sort of physical pain upon oneself. Uh,
mhm,
there are times when people might, particularly young people, might turn to those approaches, who might be experiencing maybe a lot of anxiety and might find some sort of release in that.
mhm,
Suicidality, though, is pointing to a range of experiences and behaviors. So we have suicidal thoughts, which also includes suicidal ideation.
mhm,
So that's pointing to how often, if at all, someone is actually considering suicide. We have a
mhm,
suicide plan where someone has moved from just thinking about it to actually developing a plan where
mhm,
they're considering how and when and where they would actually attempt to end their life. And then from there, there's the actual attempt where someone moves forward and actually taking the steps necessary to end their life. And so there's a continuum. We want to try to intervene early and often. And there are different supports that are needed when trying to serve somebody who's already made an attempt versus someone who is still in the phase where they're considering.
Okay, okay. And going back to the strong Black woman schema, right? So, we got it, we can handle it, right? People come
Mhm.
to us all the time, but sometimes we have this persona, but we can be really struggling inside,
Yeah.
okay? So, can we talk a little bit about what are some of the reasons that it may be hard for Black women to acknowledge that we're struggling? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're really struggling. We are suffering. What are some of the reasons that we might really have a hard time acknowledging that we're struggling?
Yeah. Well, I honestly think about the work that you lead and thinking about the experience and pressures that Black women face in the workplace and the weight of it all. Needing to be excellent at work,
Mhm.
needing to provide and take care of everyone at home,
Right.
and also respond to the crises in this world. That leaves very little time for someone to care for themselves
Mhm.
mentally, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically. And
Mhm.
so over time, I think that continuing to move forward without addressing traumas from our past, hardships from the present day, the
Mhm.
culmination of these things, I think, could certainly lead to someone getting to the point where they feel hopeless and overwhelmed. Um, when someone is feeling so hopeless that they would rather no longer be here, or they feel like ending their life would end all their problems. Those are the places where I think we really want to try to intervene before it even gets to that point. And so I think some of the reasons that Black women in particular may be experiencing increased risk for suicide, I think comes from the weight of it all being too much, and not feeling like we have trusted sources that we can turn to when we
Yeah.
are experiencing hardship and pain in our lives.
Yeah.
It's so critical that we have strong social supports and strong social connections, but also that we have the material resources and the financial assets so that we can actually go out and seek the mental health treatment we need, whether that
Mm.
means going to a clinical psychologist or even being able to meet with a psychiatrist and receiving a diagnosis and medication if necessary. All of these things, I think, are intertwined in thinking about why Black women are experiencing a lot of hardship and difficulty in this time.
Yeah, and I think that because of racism and sexism and all the things that we have to contend with
Mm.
as Black women, particularly when we get in the workplace and all the
Yeah,
toxic stuff we
certainly,
encounter in the workplace, that
certainly.
we know many times we know we're under attack. So
Yeah.
many of us are in survival mode. So we're in
Mhm.
survival mode. We know we're under attack. So we know we have to present an image, right? We know
Yeah.
that we have to mask. We know we have to do all these things. And also many times in our families and in the community, we are brought up to be in a certain role. So
Yep.
we have this expectation. So I think it's important for us as Black women, we may understand that we may need to play a role in certain areas of our lives. But what I really want for us as Black women is to find those spaces in our lives
Yeah.
where we can take the mask off, right?
Yes.
We can put the cape down. We need to have those spaces because if we don't, we become totally depleted, we're totally burnt out, and we become disconnected from ourselves. And that's when we're
Mhm.
like a shell of a person, right?
Certainly.
That's when I talk to Black women. I say, okay, so what kind of stuff do you like to do for fun? What do you like to do for joy? And it's like deer in the headlights. Like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Like, there's no understanding. There's
Yeah.
no connection to any life, no joy. And so that is what I want for us as Black women is to find those spaces, if that's in our home, a sanctuary space,
Yes.
if that's with trusted friends, but to have those spaces, because I know many times as we go out in the world, we are often under attack. So we need
Yeah.
to find those safe spaces. So one of the safe spaces that many of us may find may be in the church, right? So there might be times that the church may say, oh, you just pray away. But some churches may be very supportive of mental health. So
Mhm.
can we talk about ways of like the church or
Mm.
spirituality can be protective factors? Let's talk about some of the protective factors for
Yeah.
mental health, right? So we talked about spirituality, having a close supportive network of friends or family. What are some other protective factors? And even thinking about the church, how can the church really support access to mental health treatment?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for naming all of these things. And yeah, I've got so many places that I think I could go, but I'll say to start with that I think churches, I think, could offer relief to Black women by, I think, being places where Black women can come and receive and be in community and not have to do everything, right? So when you
Mhm,
think about who's serving in Black
mhm,
churches,
mhm,
whether it's ushering, whether it is leading youth ministries, whether it's leading community outreach efforts like a food pantry, or whether it's mothering in the church. Like there's a lot of spiritual mothering that happens in church spaces. And so
mhm,
I think that it would be beneficial for Black churches in particular to consider coming to the women of their church and asking them, how can we serve you? What do you
mhm,
need? Versus saying, hey, can you serve here and here and here and do this and this and this? Even when you think about financially supporting the needs of a church, right? Who's tithing, who's giving the resources they have, the time,
mhm,
their money, their resources, their energy, their bandwidth, all those things. Black women do so much to continue to support and uplift and honor Black church communities. And so I think it would be really meaningful for church leaders to go to the women of the church and ask them, how can we serve you? How can we best care for you? What do you practically need? Whether that's spiritual support, emotional support, financial support, that's important. I think another thing that churches can do is really have the leaders address topics of mental health from the pulpit. So when I first moved to Chicago, this was during COVID. The very first church that I visited online, it was during September, so Suicide Prevention Month. And on that day, the pastor shared that they were setting aside funds where they would give people money from the church funds to go and have 6 sessions with a mental health professional of their choice.
Whoa.
Yes, yes. And this was not a huge mega church. This was a small church plant that was just getting started here on the south side of Chicago. And so when something is shared from the leader, right? It's like from the head down, I think it communicates an importance. There's another church here in Chicago called Progressive Baptist Church, also Salem Baptist Church, the same pastor, Pastor Charlie Dates. And they've created a mental health center, a mental health ministry where they're able to provide services in that space. And so it's up to the parishioner whether or not they want to have faith-based services or not. Some people prefer that, some people don't. That's their decision.
Mhm,
But I think that when something is championed by the leader, it
mhm,
communicates something. And I think also I want to share my church in Detroit when I was in graduate school.
mhm,
My pastor was, before he became a pastor, he was a leader in the automotive industry. And he spoke openly about his own experiences with suicide and his own experiences of wanting to end his life and the
Wow.
attempts that he made. Yes. And I'm telling you, it changes the tone and the tenor of a sanctuary when the leader is vulnerable in that really bold and brave way. And so I think that when a leader champions or humanizes or communicates that they too have struggled and also puts some material resources behind it, it can be really beneficial and really meaningful for the people to hear.
Dr. Goodwill, so he openly talks about this? The
My
past?
former pastor, yes, he would. He's since passed away, but
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
he would openly talk about his experiences from decades ago when he was experiencing risk of suicide and thoughts of suicide. And again, this is someone who's very put together, someone on the outside, someone who people see and who is a spiritual leader. But again, I think this is just my opinion. But if somebody has actually, particularly Christians, if they've actually read the text, they're going to see examples of people who have also been at that same place. There are instances of extreme depression and even suicide risk in the Bible. And so it would seem odd to me for a church not to address those issues, to be honest.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the risk factors and warning signs for suicide.
Okay.
So if somebody's watching this and they notice certain things, what are
Yeah.
some of the risk factors that they need to be aware of or warning signs that they could say, wait a minute, this is something I need to be aware of? And
Mhm.
then once they recognize these things, what they need to do.
Great. Great. So I'll answer that. And then I realized I didn't even answer the question you asked me previously around protective factors. So
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. So
Okay.
I'll
Got it.
answer this one and then I'll talk about protective
Got
factors.
it.
So
Okay.
some risk and warning signs. So I think hopelessness. If you, and when we look around the world, there's many reasons for people to be experiencing hopelessness right now. Like that is understandable.
Yeah.
So increased hopelessness, withdrawal, disillusionment, even anger. Um, Continued forms of anger. I think even when we see another sign people point to is maybe if someone is actually talking about death or if they're talking about giving away their possessions and trying to get rid of things, that might be a sign or a signal that this person actually has a plan and
Mhm.
that they could be considering. Very practically speaking, considering what do they have access to? What's their capability for suicide? Do they have access to a gun? Do they have
Mhm.
access to medications that they could use to attempt an overdose?
Mhm.
There's been other research that shows that across different disciplines and different fields of work, there is greater risk for suicide. So when we think about who has access to guns, police officers, right? Who has
Mhm.
access to medications? People in the health professions. So nurses and doctors, we've seen even suicides amongst that profession. And so
Yeah.
I think considering these interpersonal things, again, like the hopelessness, the increased anger, the withdrawal, someone giving something away or giving lots of things away, that's the interpersonal things, but also these larger structural things like do they actually have access to guns or medications
Mhm.
that could be used to attempt their life? I think that those are definitely things that we want to look out for. Also, something really important that the research has shown is that one of the strongest predictors of death by suicide is previous attempt. Okay. One of the strongest predictors of suicide is a previous attempt. And so, if someone has previously attempted suicide, the odds of them dying by suicide increase a lot. And so, we want to ensure that when we're thinking about risk factors, who in our community do we know has already made an attempt, or who in our community do we know has already seriously considered suicide? Those are people that we
Mhm.
want to continue to care for, no matter how outgoing or gregarious or successful they may seem on the outside. We want to
Mhm.
ensure that they're feeling supported
Mhm.
throughout their time as well.
Mhm.
What you should do. This is the question. This is the key question that people always come to. So I want to point folks to an important resource that's
Mhm.
on the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention website, afsp.org. They literally have drop-down menus that show you what to do, give you very clear directions if you are concerned about someone or
Mhm.
if you yourself are considering suicide. So practically what someone should do is directly ask their loved one or ask their friend or ask the person that they're in relationship with, are you considering suicide? that is the question they should ask. And I want to encourage people to recognize that asking someone if they're suicidal does not give them the idea. You're not planting the idea in their head if you're
Mhm.
simply asking if they're suicidal. In
Mhm.
the event that someone says that they are suicidal and that they're considering suicide, then from the next step, asking them, do they have a plan? And from there, seeking help immediately will be critically important. So whether that is going to an emergency room or seeking help from a mental health professional that's in their community, utilizing hotlines like 988 and others will be especially important. Okay.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
those are some of the risk factors and also what we can do.
Can I
Um,
say something too? And also, you can call 911, but let them know this is a mental health emergency. Okay? You don't want to just have police come in. Okay? Let them
right.
know this is a
Right.
mental health emergency.
Yeah, yeah, and that I want to encourage people to consider where you are locally. We've had some challenging situations with that here in my city, and so um, there are many things to consider. But again, utilize that resource on the afsp.org website that
Mhm.
will give you information. They actually have on the AFSP website they have a resource that is Black mental health. Online resource supports that people can consider. So whether that's any text lines or hotlines or online websites. There's many to consider and choose from there. Okay.
Awesome.
Now, getting back to the question you asked earlier around protective factors, I
Uh-huh.
think that this is very important because we are not helpless in this work. Like we
Mhm.
can do something to support the people that we care about who are
Mhm.
experiencing a very hard time. So,
Mhm.
drawing from the strengths that we already have. So, communally, that means that we are checking in, caring for one another. I think an important protective factor that I've seen in my own work is really focusing on having a sense of purpose or meaning in life.
Mm.
Across my research studies, the Black folks in my research studies who report that they have a sense of strong purpose and meaning in life, even when there's all sorts of chaos in the world, those folks are reporting better mental health outcomes. So I just want to encourage the audience to really hold on to the truth that your life has meaning and your life has purpose. And even if you don't know what it is yet, if you can hold on to the central truth that your life has meaning and purpose and that you're here for a reason, that
Mhm.
can help buoy somebody through difficult challenges and stormy waters. Other
Wow.
protective factors that I've seen are things like gratitude. So, my colleague and I, we published a study earlier this year where we looked at a sample of Black adults, and
Mhm.
folks who reported more gratitude are reporting less suicidal ideation. So, by no means am I trying to just say, hey, just be grateful and you'll feel better. But
Right.
psychologically, there is a benefit to focusing on thankfulness and gratitude, and that having improved mental health outcomes over time as well.
Mhm.
Things like having a strong sense of racial identity. So, especially in this time, I want to highlight that the research has shown for decades that it is important for Black children to like that they are Black. Okay. So,
Mhm.
having a sense of strong racial identity, racial centrality, affirming a young person in their racial identity development is critically important. Instilling a sense of racial and ethnic pride in young people. So,
Mhm.
showing them positive images throughout history and current day of Black
Mhm.
folks in their communities and even across the world who
Mhm.
have done so many amazing things can help protect against these adverse mental health outcomes, whether it's depression or suicide risk. And so yeah, I think really tying in these aspects of racial and ethnic pride, really
Mhm.
pointing to having a sense of uh, strong racial identity and really tying in these other positive psychology factors like purpose, like meaning in life, like gratitude, I think have
Mhm.
all been shown to be really helpful and beneficial.
Perfect, perfect. And I remember when I used to do a lot of crisis response work when I used to work for the school district, and something that I was that we used to talk about was be mindful when someone who was like really depressed, all of a sudden it seemed like there was a total change in their behavior, right?
Mhm.
Like they were very depressed for a long time, and all of a sudden it seemed like everything was better, right? To like really watch out for that person because they may have really made the decision to end their life and they had kind of come to peace with that. So we
Mhm.
need to really look at changes in baseline behavior. So even if we might think, oh, everything's so much better, we need to also look out for people like that too, because if we see a drastic change in their baseline behavior from someone who's very depressed, please don't think that everything's all better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still monitor, still ask the questions. And I'm so glad that you really said that about you need to ask them directly. You need
Mhm.
to ask them if they're having these thoughts directly. You're not putting the thought in their head. I've heard that
Mhm.
so many times about, I don't want to say that I don't want to ask them because I don't want to put the thought in their head. That's your anxiety that
Yeah.
you don't want to ask them, but that's not putting the thought in their head. So you made reference to, your papers that you've written and your research. Can you tell us about your research? Tell us about the work that you do.
Certainly. So I lead a series of different research projects here in Chicago that are all focused on preventing suicide and improving mental health outcomes and experiences for Black communities. And so my work with adults has mostly focused on using survey data to measure relationships between important experiences. So like I mentioned earlier, looking at the relationship between gratitude and suicide risk, or looking at the relationship between hopelessness and mental health outcomes. We're able to see and use statistics to actually determine how we can interrupt this relationship between hopelessness and negative mental health outcomes. I've also used survey data to measure positive outcomes. So I also measure and think about what factors can help somebody experience more hope or more joy? I think really centering and asking questions about joy in research is very important. Researchers are really good at looking at all the bad things and naming all the bad things, but
Sure.
it is so important in my work that I try to offer people some pathways towards something positive of what they can do. Because in my work, it's not helpful to just tell someone, don't take your life. That's not a
Right.
helpful place to begin or end a conversation. What's
Mhm.
really needed is to offer people some sort of information or resource that can help them believe that their life can be better. And so, in my work that focuses on hope and joy, we've been able to see that having these sort of personal forms of devotion, whether that's reading religious materials, listening to religious music, engaging in religious communities. So, simply going into a place of worship is not enough. It really matters that people feel connected to the other
Mm,
folks in that religious community, right?
mhm.
That is all linked to better mental health outcomes.
Okay.
With the young people, I'm currently leading a project in Chicago Public Schools, leading a program where we are offering a suicide prevention program to Black middle school students in local schools. And so this has been really a heavy lift, but it's so important and so critical. And we've got some great partners here in the district, but we're trying to intervene early. I think a lot of people may not know that there are children as young as 8 years old here who have died by suicide. Black
Yeah.
children as young as 8 years old who died by suicide here in the city. And so we want to try to intervene early because we want to help give kids the language so that they
Yeah.
know where to go to help and
Yeah.
so that they know where to go to get help, and they can also know where they can find support within the school community and outside in their neighborhoods.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're doing great work in my hometown. If
Oh, thank
people
you.
don't know, I am from Chicago.
Yes,
So
yes.
I appreciate that. And you know what? It's so heartbreaking to hear anybody
Mm,
dying by suicide,
yeah.
to hear from someone, because I have lost someone to suicide.
Mm,
But the part too that I really want to really elevate is sometimes we think, oh, young kids, you
yeah.
know, we shouldn't talk about this with young kids because they don't think that way. They don't, but no, they do, right? And so sometimes we hear young kids, 5,
Yeah,
who will make these comments and we say, oh, they're just playing. They don't mean it. We have to take that seriously.
yeah,
I don't care how young they are. If they're saying something like that or engaging in behaviors that we have concern, we need to follow up with them.
yes.
Now, we have to be mindful of how we ask them, right? We have to say things or ask them in a way that they understand what we're
Right.
asking them. But we need to ask them because, again, kids as young as 5 have died by suicide. So we have to really follow up. So I'm so thankful that you did mention that the age consideration,
Yes.
because sometimes we think, "Oh, no, no, no. they're too young. They're too young. No, no, no. We need to pay attention to that. Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to read the community chat, and then Dr. Goodwill, before we finish, I want to, number one, give you an opportunity to share how people can connect with you.
Great.
And then I also want to give you an opportunity to share any last words that you want to share with the community before we wind down, okay? So
Certainly.
I see people checking in and saying thank you for talking about this topic. Yes, this is a heavy topic and a necessary topic. Hello,
Mhm.
Marissa. Good to see you. I had a peer and family member who unfortunately experienced a situation. Yes, committed stigmatizes. Yes, so the terminology committed suicide is very stigmatizing. Person, first language is key. Yes. Always thinking about Dr. Antoinette Bonnie Candia Bailey. Yes, agreed. As stated, Dr. Kamani, I appreciate you and I urge everyone to take care of your mental health and overall wellness. Yes, we all need to take responsibility and be mindful of taking care of ourselves. So true. RIP. Yes, rest in peace, Dr. Candia Bailey. Yes, yes, absolutely. And again, thank you for sharing this resource. Thank you so much. It's very helpful. So, Dr. Goodwill, can you please share how people can stay connected to you?
Certainly. So I am starting a new Instagram. So you can follow me on my journey there at Professor Goodwill. At Professor, and then last name is Goodwill, Goodwill, there on the screen. So you can follow me on Instagram there. That's probably the best place for you to see some of my translational work and how I'm taking the research and trying to make it accessible to public audiences.
Awesome. And any last words you want to share with the audience?
Yes. Hope is available. Joy is for you, and your life has meaning, it has purpose, and it matters. And so, please pursue peace in this time. We are seeing all sorts of assaults and attacks on Black lives, but those things do not negate the truth that you matter and your life is worthy. So, please believe that things will not always be as hard as they are right now, and that you are seen and cared for.
Agreed. I co-sign with everything she just said. So everyone, thank you so much for watching. And please, please, if you weren't able to watch the full video because of the heaviness of the content, I encourage you to kind of just watch it in stages in terms of just monitoring yourself as you're watching the content. Please share this information with other people because the more we're aware of this, the more that we can save more of us in our community. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do so. Turn the notification bell so you know when I'm going live or I'm uploading a video. And please give this video a thumbs up. So I will see you later. Thank you again, Dr. Goodwill. And everyone else, I will see you later. Take care. Bye-bye.